outside of Napoleon Dynamite, the Minecraft movie, and Yellowstone's Zone of Death, you probably haven't thought too much about Eastern Idaho. But why? After all, Boise has one of the hottest housing markets in America. Grand Teton and Yellowstone are partially located in the state, and Idaho is home to some of the most breathtaking scenery in North America. So it's not like the eastern half just has nothing to offer. Shoshone Falls is taller than Niagara, the Snake River is home to world-class fishing and hot springs. In fact, Lava Hot Springs is arguably the closest thing you can find to an onsen town in America. And when it comes to wildlife, raising a family, or just enjoying the outdoors, Eastern Idaho's quality is unmatched. Or is it? Despite all of these amazing traits on paper, Eastern Idaho remains underdeveloped, economically poor, and honestly irrelevant in the business world. Compared to neighboring regions like the Wasatch Front in Utah, the Front Range in Colorado, the I-90 corridor in Montana, or the Truckee Meadows in Nevada, there's just not a lot going on in Eastern Idaho. And today, we're going to investigate why. So pour yourself a ramekin full of fry sauce, subscribe if you're new, and let's just get right into it. The first thing you'll notice about Eastern Idaho is a complete lack of economic diversity. There are no major cities in the region, and about half the population, 150,000-ish people, live in very small towns or isolated homesteads, with the other 150,000 living in the small cities of Pocatello, Twin Falls, and Idaho Falls, which, unsurprisingly, means that agriculture dominates the region's economy. Nearly a third of the United States' potatoes come from Eastern Idaho, and a significant amount of barley for beer is produced there as well, with Coors, Anheuser-Busch, and Modelo all operating within that region. Outside of farming, Eastern Idaho is also home to Idaho National Labs, one of the US's main nuclear laboratories, and Idaho State University operates the Center for Advanced Energy Studies, which both supply a significant amount of career opportunities in nuclear and related forms of science and engineering. So, tangential to that, education is also a big career opportunity in the region. But education is where we start to see a double-edged sword in Eastern Idaho's economic viability. Idaho State University is located in Pocatello, and Brigham Young University, Idaho, is located in Rexburg. At any given time, there are nearly 40,000 college students studying in Eastern Idaho, accounting for 1 in every 13 people living in the region, and putting Eastern Idaho nearly on par with national averages in terms of education levels, despite the area having so few economic opportunities and despite it being so rural. So this is where the double-edged sword comes in, because brain drain is a massive issue for the region, because young adults, especially members of the LDS Church, are encouraged to go to college in order to date so that they can get married young, making the traditional college experience a surprisingly large part of Mormon culture, and partially explaining the high amount of universities along the Mormon corridor relative to population. So unless those young adults go on to study something like agriculture, engineering, or education, it can be pretty hard for them to find jobs post-graduation, forcing a lot of new graduates to move to Boise, Salt Lake City, or Montana in search of work. Rampant brain drain, coupled with a lack of major cities, means that very few business investments are made in Eastern Idaho. It just doesn't make sense for a lot of companies to open up somewhere like Pocatello or Twin Falls, even though, in theory, there are a ton of college-educated young adults around who want to stay close to home. So this creates something of an economic catch-22, where companies don't move there because people aren't staying, but then people aren't staying because companies aren't moving there. This also means that the state doesn't put a lot of money into infrastructure either. Amtrak completely completely bypasses Eastern Idaho, and they have nothing like the frontrunner that connects cities in Utah or the various rail networks connecting Colorado's cities. Not only that, but the airport service leaves much to be desired. If someone wants to get to Yellowstone or Grand Teton National Parks, then the standard travel advice is to fly into either Bozeman, Montana, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, or even Salt Lake City, Utah first, and then drive up. Eastern Idaho could benefit heavily from supporting the tourism that they already have with infrastructure, but the region just fails to deliver. Not only that, but housing prices in Idaho have grown more out of control than almost any other state. With a 156% inflation in housing prices over the past decade, compared to 35% overall inflation during that time. But the problem with trying to understand things like housing and inflation is just how politically motivated a lot of news outlets tend to be when reporting about these subjects. Which is why I'm incredibly happy to say that today's video is being sponsored by Ground News, a service that I've been personally using for years now. I analyze the job market for a living, and it's mind-boggling how political pretty much any news about my career is. Just recently, the president fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the political responses to that were off the charts, with stories on the right saying that the bureau head was dismissed on an accusation of manipulating numbers to make the president look bad, to reporters on the left saying that Donald Trump fired her because the raw economic data hurt his feelings. Depending on your news source, you're being given completely different stories about why something happened, what went wrong, and who's to blame. So that's where Ground News comes in. Their coverage details feature allows you to see how many and which news sources are covering a particular story, all in one place. And their compare headlines feature allows you to see how different outlets frame the same story by comparing headlines across the political spectrum. Not only that, but they provide factuality metrics to see just how reliable the reporting practices of news outlets covering a story are, and even ownership data so that you can see who's funding these news publications, be it governments, media conglomerates, independents, or even wealthy individuals. Ground News is invaluable for understanding what's going on in the US and the broader world, both socially and economically. So go to ground.news/UF for a better way to stay informed. Subscribe to get 40% off the Vantage plan by scanning this QR code or using my link, which again is ground.news/UF. Ground News doesn't take ad dollars from these news outlets or media companies, so it's subscribers like us who help keep journalism transparent and accountable. However, it's not just the economy sabotaging Eastern Idaho. I know that a lot of you heard that last section and thought, dude, heck yeah, I'm down to work in ag or engineering. Sign me up for an isolated homestead surrounded by mountains and hot springs. But not so fast. First, we need to discuss cultural issues. This is hard to say for certain, but when you look at a combination of ancestry and religious affiliation spread out across such a large area of 300,000 people, Eastern Idaho is likely the single least diverse region of the United States. Nearly 90% of the population is white, but not only are they white, about a third of the population is specifically of English descent, with Madison County, where Rexburg is located, often leading the US in terms of people of English heritage. Now, if you didn't know, most white people in the US are specifically of German descent, not English. And while we don't really like to acknowledge this in the States, the type of white that you are plays a big role in everything from public health to politics to food to anything else caught up in a local culture. And then religiously, Eastern Idaho is the second most densely Mormon portion of the country after Utah Valley, with over 2/3 of the area's population identifying as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This combination of ethnic and religious homogeny has some seriously negative social ramifications for anyone who doesn't fit that mold, to the point that even your stereotypical straight white Christian male has a hard time finding work or making friends in that area if they aren't Mormon or if they aren't already ancestrally tied to the region, which subtly forces almost everyone who moves there into non-Mormon businesses and neighborhoods so that they can actually make a decent living and so that their kids can grow up around other kids who are actually allowed to play with them. This might sound silly to anyone who's never lived in the Rockies before, but this is a very real issue that you just can't avoid when you're in the area. Across the Mormon corridor, non-Mormons form their own cultural group, and it's incredibly common for Christians, atheists, neo-pagans, and people of all skin colors to end up being friends with and working together because they are all experiencing a shared economic and social suppression by the Mormon majority. Unfortunately, nothing unifies people quite like a common enemy. So if you don't jive with all the trappings of non-Mormon culture, like breweries, tattoos, and having a diverse group of mostly neo-pagan friends, then you are just not going to enjoy living in Eastern Idaho. Hard stop. Now, I do want to make it clear that you are far more likely to experience something like discrimination or hate crimes in one of America's coastal big cities than you are ever going to be in Eastern Idaho. Crime overall is incredibly low, and usually Mormons are a lot more subtle in the way that they exclude others or punish those on the inside who go against the grain, but things aren't all hunky-dory for the white Mormons living in Eastern Idaho either. The cultural pressure to be both educated and raise a large family puts tremendous financial strain on young adults living in an area with so few economic opportunities. And there's actually quite a bit of research coming out right now to suggest that the region's increase in cost of housing has a lot more to do with the amount of babies being born than it ever had to do with the amount of people moving there. But if you ever talk to some dude at a gas station in Burley about what's going on with the cost of living, he's gonna feed you some BS about Californians moving there during the pandemic and driving the cost of everything up. However, when you look at the raw economic data, that's just not true. While it might look like Eastern Idaho is suffering from the exact same issues with housing and cost of living costs that the rest of the country is, the reason behind those economic trends is very unique to Eastern Idaho. Speaking of problems unique to Idaho, political corruption is another thing that drives a lot of potential business investment away. Idaho consistently ranks as one of the top 10 most politically corrupt states in the Union, with white-collar crimes, political bribery, and not holding public officials accountable for their wrongdoings being some of the biggest issues. And this makes it incredibly hard for new businesses to establish themselves outside of Boise, unless that business happens to already agree with kind of the broader LDS agenda, and is a big part of why Eastern Idaho has failed to piggyback off of the clout of Grand Teton and Yellowstone in the same ways that Montana and Wyoming successfully have. So, what can be done to improve Eastern Idaho? Not just for visitors, but for the people who already live there. Well, there are a few things, in my view. First and foremost, infrastructure really needs to be ramped up. Interstate 15 is one of the most beautiful drives in North America. Starting in LA, you've got the Pacific Ocean, and then Death Valley, and then Vegas, and then the Red Rock National Parks, and then the Wasatch Front, and then Big Sky, all the way up through Montana and eventually into Alberta near Glacier and Banff National Parks. Insane that you can see all of that in a 20-hour road trip. But the portion that goes through Eastern Idaho is significantly lacking in good stops for people driving along the way. Personally, I think things like the hot springs and the Snake River could bring a lot of positive wellness tourism to the area and could provide a really good central stopping point between California and Banff for people who are making that trip on the road. But even for people not on the road, Eastern Idaho really needs a proper airport, man. There is just no good reason to fly into Idaho Falls Regional unless you're attending BYU-I. So Eastern Idaho is losing a ton of money to Jackson, Wyoming, a city that people don't really want to fly into anyway because it's so ungodly expensive on account account of not having a real airport. So I believe that that's an important step. But beyond infrastructure, positive changes in politics, culture, and business practices are likely going to happen at the state level. Boise is cool, and as Western Idaho continues to be an incredibly attractive place for people to launch their careers and to raise their families, my hope is that some of that will positively start to trickle out east. Cronyism and stupid laws around things like alcohol are virtually impossible to fight from the ground. So a lot of that is just going to have to come down from the top at the state level. But there is still something to be said for individuals taking pride in their home, starting businesses that fill in those economic gaps, supporting laws that actually support young families, and being happy when people want to visit Eastern Idaho and appreciate the place that you call home. Because Idaho is just too great to litter. But in all seriousness, Eastern Idaho has so much potential, and I would love to see this portion of the United States continue to thrive into the future.